At precisely 7:30 in the freezing, blood-stained morning of June 6, 1944, a 51-year-old American officer named Lieutenant General Norman Cota violently stepped off a shattered landing craft directly into the suffocating, mechanized jaws of hell. The sprawling, heavily fortified stretch of Normandy sand, codenamed Omaha Beach, was mathematically supposed to be entirely secured by now, but the absolute, terrifying reality was an unmitigated, apocalyptic slaughter. The freezing shoreline was already thickly littered with the motionless, bleeding bodies of dead and dying young men, while shattered landing craft burned furiously on the violent waterline, aggressively churning thick, acrid black smoke into the chaotic, lead-filled sky. The highly anticipated, massive Allied aerial and naval bombardment that was supposed to completely obliterate the deeply entrenched German defenses had missed its targets entirely, leaving the terrifying concrete bunkers perfectly intact and aggressively raining a relentless, unrelenting hurricane of machine gun fire down upon the paralyzed American infantry. Worse still, the Allied intelligence apparatus had catastrophically, unforgivably failed. The enemy manning those towering fortifications was not a demoralized, second-rate garrison unit of old men and conscripts, but the battle-hardened elite Waffen-SS 352nd Panzer Division, utterly ruthless veterans of the freezing Eastern Front who had been meticulously preparing for this exact blood-soaked massacre. Staring directly into this absolute suffocating chaos, Cota looked at the violent disintegration of the American assault and immediately executed an action that completely, fundamentally defied every single instinct of human self-preservation ever programmed into a living being. Surrounded by hundreds of terrified, heavily burdened soldiers, violently clutching their M1 Garand assault rifles and pressing their bodies into the wet sand in a state of absolute, paralyzing shock behind cruel steel obstacles, Cota did not crouch, he did not seek cover, and he absolutely refused to crawl. He stood fully, defiantly upright, aggressively walking across the open, blood-soaked beach, as if the thousands of incoming supersonic German bullets simply could not touch his flesh. Men who were violently shaking, completely paralyzed with the deeply rational terror of being violently ripped apart by interlocking fields of MG-42 fire, looked up in absolute, uncomprehending disbelief to see a general casually strolling past them like he was walking through a quiet, sunlit park. He aggressively moved from pinned-down group to pinned-down group, violently kicking terrified men to their feet, aggressively pointing his sidearm towards the towering, death-spitting bluffs, and ruthlessly demanding they advance, famously shouting to the pinned-down 5th Rangers, a command that violently birthed the eternal motto the U.S. Army Rangers carry to this very day. Exactly 8 miles offshore, desperately gripping the freezing steel railing of the heavy cruiser USS Augusta, General Omar Bradley stared through binoculars deeply smeared with corrosive salt spray at the unfolding apocalyptic catastrophe and seriously considered the absolute unmitigated nightmare of a complete humiliating evacuation. The terrifying thought of pulling the bleeding, shattered survivors off Omaha, aggressively redirecting the massive follow-up waves to Utah Beach or the adjacent British sector at Gold, and officially, globally admitting that the American assault had mathematically failed was a deeply suffocating prospect. And yet, somewhere in the highly secure, heavily fortified war rooms of London, a man named Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the professional head of the British Army, was quietly, almost inevitably, waiting for exactly this devastating, world-shattering news. For 2 agonizing years, Brooke had been repeatedly, explicitly recording in his private, brutally candid diaries that the Americans simply could not fight a modern, mechanized war against a deeply entrenched fascist empire. In the deeply fossilized, highly aristocratic view of the British military establishment, the incoming Americans were profoundly too green, far too blindly optimistic, and dangerously, catastrophically naive about what the terrifying German war machine could actually do to untested, unhardened flesh. To genuinely understand this suffocating, deeply ingrained British doubt that cast a massive, paralyzing shadow over the morning of June 6th, you must mathematically trace the bloodline back to the humiliating, unmitigated disaster at Kasserine Pass in the freezing February of 1943. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, aggressively launched a devastating attack through the narrow Atlas Mountains of Tunisia with his veteran Afrika Korps, the completely untested, poorly led American Second Corps violently and catastrophically collapsed, breaking and running in a disorganized panic that left over 6,000 casualties, 183 destroyed tanks, and hundreds of burning half-tracks scattered across the desert in just 2 days. The deeply traumatized British, who had personally endured the apocalyptic, desperate evacuations of Dunkirk and the humiliating, world-shattering surrender of the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore to the Japanese, watched this horrific American debacle from the front row with brutal, unyielding skepticism. While Field Marshal Brooke held an absolute, deep reverence for the terrifying industrial might of Detroit and Pittsburgh, manufacturing more war material than the entire Axis powers combined, he fundamentally, immovably believed that American soldiers were hopelessly inexperienced amateurs, arrogantly trying to dictate high-level strategy to men who had been violently bleeding, losing, and burying their friends since the dark September of 1939. This profound, deeply institutional distrust aggressively shaped and paralyzed every single aspect of the cross-channel invasion planning, sparking vicious, ego-driven political warfare between the most powerful men in the fragile Allied coalition. While Prime Minister Winston Churchill desperately advocated for cautious peripheral campaigns of grinding attrition in Norway, the Mediterranean, or the Balkans to slowly bleed the German army dry before risking a direct assault, the aggressive, unyielding U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall ruthlessly demanded a massive, heavily concentrated strike straight into the deeply fortified teeth of the Atlantic Wall to violently end the slaughter. The agonizing geopolitical deadlock was only violently broken when the ruthless Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin aligned completely with Roosevelt at the Tehran Conference in November 1943, effectively outnumbering Churchill and forcing the deeply reluctant, highly cautious British to mathematically agree to a firm invasion date. Yet, even as the colossal, unprecedented armada finally crossed the dark, turbulent waters of the English Channel, the suffocating, unanswerable British question remained entirely unresolved. Would these deeply optimistic, profoundly untested farm boys from Iowa, Texas, and Virginia violently break and run when they finally met the merciless, battle-hardened veterans of the German war machine? On the deeply suffocating, rain-lashed, entirely unforgiving night of June 5, 1944, hidden away in a highly classified, claustrophobic command trailer somewhere in the sprawling darkness of southern England, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat entirely alone and meticulously penned a handwritten note that violently, permanently captured the apocalyptic stakes of the looming invasion. Not the famous, deeply romanticized broadcast about the great, shining crusade that would officially echo across the free world, but a devastating, deeply personal 66-word resignation letter that absolutely nobody was ever supposed to physically see. Recognizing the mathematically terrifying fragility of the impending cross-channel assault, the Supreme Commander of the largest, most heavily armed invasion force in human history cold-bloodedly accepted complete, unmitigated personal responsibility for a catastrophic, blood-soaked failure that had not yet even officially occurred. Deliberately underlining the heavy, agonizing words "mine alone" with a thick, unforgiving stroke of his pen, Eisenhower explicitly refused to shift the historical blame to the terrified troops, the Air Corps, or the massive Navy, silently folding the deeply haunting, mistakenly dated document into his worn leather wallet before stepping out into the freezing night to look the doomed paratroopers of the 101st Airborne directly in their eyes. The absolute paralyzing reality of that crumpled, unsent note violently demonstrates that Eisenhower mathematically knew the intricately engineered, highly complex battle plan for Omaha Beach was deeply, fundamentally flawed, and that tens of thousands of young, completely untested American boys were about to be aggressively hurled directly into a mechanized meat grinder. The original, highly sophisticated and theoretically brilliant operational blueprint for the Omaha sector was mathematically designed to be an overwhelming apocalyptic display of absolute, unmitigated Allied industrial firepower, meticulously orchestrated to completely shatter the terrifying Atlantic wall before a single infantryman ever touched the freezing surf. In the pitch-black, deeply terrifying pre-dawn darkness, hundreds of colossal four-engine B-17 Superfortress heavy bombers were scheduled to aggressively saturate the towering, heavily fortified German bluffs, dropping thousands of tons of high explosives to violently crater the pristine sand and create vital, life-saving foxholes for the violently exposed advancing infantry. Simultaneously, a massive, unprecedented armada of heavy naval warships was mathematically supposed to relentlessly pound the sprawling, interconnected concrete bunkers for agonizing, uninterrupted hours, completely shattering the psychological resolve of the deeply demoralized second-rate defenders from the 716th Static Infantry Division. A supposedly pathetic garrison composed entirely of older, sickly men and deeply terrified foreign conscripts deemed entirely unfit for the brutal meat grinder of the Eastern Front. Directly following this apocalyptic, earth-shattering bombardment, 32 highly experimental, heavily modified M4A3E8 Easy-8 Sherman tanks, completely fitted with fragile, suffocating canvas flotation screens, were supposed to swim seamlessly ashore with the very first assault wave, providing an impenetrable mobile wall of heavy artillery to physically shield the deeply vulnerable, seasick infantrymen as they aggressively scaled the shattered bluffs. By precisely 8:30 in the morning, the deeply optimistic, mathematically perfect operational timeline explicitly mandated that the heavily armed American combat forces would be aggressively pushing a full, undisputed mile inland. But the absolute, horrifying reality of modern, unpredictable mechanized warfare aggressively, violently intervened to completely obliterate this mathematically perfect strategy before the blood-red sun even breached the freezing horizon. When the massive, roaring armadas of heavy Allied bombers finally arrived directly over the deeply fortified Omaha sector, they found themselves entirely, suffocatingly blinded by an impossibly thick, impenetrable layer of heavy cloud cover, completely obscuring the vital, heavily defended beaches below. Deeply terrified of accidentally unleashing their devastating apocalyptic payloads directly onto the heavily populated decks of the massive Allied invasion fleet aggressively idling in the turbulent channel, the highly anxious, sweating bombardiers catastrophically delayed their release mechanisms by a matter of mere agonizing seconds. In those incredibly brief, deeply fatal seconds, the roaring aircraft traveled just far enough that every single devastating bomb violently slammed not onto the heavily fortified concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, but harmlessly, uselessly, into the empty, sprawling cattle fields miles behind the vital defensive line, leaving every single terrifying German machine gun nest and heavy artillery position completely, perfectly untouched. Compounding this catastrophic, blood-soaked failure from the skies, the vital, absolutely critical pre-landing naval bombardment was completely, inexplicably cut short, lasting a pathetic, wholly inadequate 40 minutes before the agonizing order to cease fire was aggressively given over the furious, deeply enraged objections of Rear Admiral John Hall of the Pacific Fleet, who correctly, violently predicted that sending completely unsupported, heavily burdened infantrymen directly into the teeth of an undamaged, fully operational fascist fortress was an absolute, unmitigated military crime. As the terrifying, deeply catastrophic failure of the massive aerial and naval bombardment quietly unfolded, the deeply chaotic, violently turbulent waters of the freezing English Channel were actively preparing to violently execute the most horrifying, suffocating tragedy of the entire morning. The highly experimental, deeply fragile amphibious Sherman tanks were mathematically engineered to safely operate in incredibly calm, highly manageable wave swells of barely 1 single foot, but the violently churning, relentlessly aggressive channel on the morning of June 6th was violently hurling massive, unforgiving 5-foot swells that aggressively tore at the vulnerable, suffocating canvas screens. In the deeply chaotic, violently turbulent eastern sector of the blood-stained beach, the terrified crews of 29 massive, heavily armored DD tanks were aggressively ordered to launch their 30-ton machines directly from the safety of their landing craft into the freezing, violently churning abyss of the open ocean. Within a matter of mere agonizingly terrifying minutes, the massive, deeply relentless waves aggressively overwhelmed the fragile, completely inadequate canvas flotation screens, violently sending 27 of those massive, heavily armored machines plummeting directly to the dark, freezing bottom of the suffocating channel. Entire, highly trained armored crews were violently, permanently trapped inside these suffocating, sinking steel coffins, drowning in absolute, unmitigated pitch-black terror before the actual blood-soaked battle on the freezing sands had even officially begun, completely mathematically stripping the deeply vulnerable advancing infantry of their absolutely vital, heavily armored mobile artillery support. However, in the violently chaotic, heavily contested western sector of the apocalyptic killing field, a single, highly experienced, deeply defiant American tank commander took one long, terrifying look at those massive, violently churning 5-foot swells, looked down at the pathetic, entirely inadequate canvas screens enveloping his multi-ton armored vehicles, and aggressively, fundamentally, refused to execute a mathematically suicidal launch order. Entirely bypassing the rigid, deeply fossilized operational doctrine that was actively, violently drowning his comrades just miles away, he ruthlessly commanded the terrified pilots of the specialized landing craft to aggressively drive their highly vulnerable, thinly armored vessels directly through the screaming, interlocking hail of German artillery fire to physically deposit his heavy Shermans directly onto the blood-soaked, violently contested sand. That single, deeply insubordinate, split-second judgment call made in the terrifying, chaotic heat of absolute carnage miraculously saved his entire heavy, armored unit from a suffocating, watery grave, providing the absolute only shred of heavy covering fire for the deeply terrified, utterly exposed infantrymen who were currently being violently slaughtered in the surf. But this isolated, desperately improvised tactical victory could not mathematically compensate for the absolute, overarching intelligence catastrophe that awaited the completely green, entirely unsuspecting American farm boys currently vomiting in their landing craft, men who had been confidently, falsely assured they would be violently fighting demoralized, sickly conscripts, only to walk directly into the merciless, perfectly calibrated crosshairs of a heavily fortified, fully operational German combat machine that had spent months meticulously registering every single agonizing inch of the beach for maximum, unmitigated slaughter. The absolute, most catastrophic surprise of the entire apocalyptic morning was not the terrifying, violently churning ocean or the deeply pathetic failure of the massive aerial bombardment, but a fundamental, unmitigated collapse of the highest levels of Allied military intelligence that mathematically doomed the first assault wave to an absolute, inescapable slaughter. The deeply terrified, violently seasick American boys heading relentlessly toward the heavily fortified, blood-soaked sands of Omaha on the freezing morning of June 6th had been confidently, arrogantly assured by their deeply disconnected, highly aristocratic commanders that the sprawling, interconnected concrete bunkers were pathetically defended by the demoralized, second-rate 716th Static Division. However, completely undetected by the highly sophisticated, incredibly praised Allied espionage networks, the fiercely disciplined, deeply battle-hardened veterans of the German 352nd Infantry Division had quietly, meticulously moved directly into the heavily fortified Omaha sector in March 1944. These were absolutely not the sickly, elderly conscripts the deeply optimistic, mathematically flawed pre-invasion briefings had promised. These were ruthless, highly experienced younger soldiers led by vicious, combat-tested officers transferred directly from the frozen, apocalyptic meat grinder of the Eastern Front, completely equipped with superior heavy weaponry, exceptionally high morale, and who had spent agonizing, uninterrupted months perfectly fortifying their devastating, interlocking fields of fire for this exact, blood-drenched moment. To genuinely, viscerally comprehend the absolute suffocating terror and unmitigated human tragedy of this catastrophic intelligence failure, You must meticulously examine the deeply personal, heartbreaking reality of the terrified men who violently walked directly into this perfectly orchestrated, mechanized fascist trap because they were absolutely not faceless. Mathematical statistics on a general's map. In the quiet, deeply isolated, entirely unsuspecting small agricultural town of Bedford, Virginia, boasting a deeply modest, close-knit population of just 3,200 quiet souls, an incredibly tight-knit National Guard unit, designated as Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, famously known as the Screaming Eagles of the 29th Infantry Division, had violently, irreversibly federalized for global mechanized war. 37 profoundly innocent, wildly optimistic young men from Bedford and the surrounding rural county had eagerly, naively joined the Guard years before the apocalyptic conflict. Some for the desperately needed single shiny dollar they received at each weekend drill, and some out of pure, unadulterated, deeply American patriotism. These simple, hard-working clerks, quiet farmers, and exhausted factory workers had trained together for agonizing, uninterrupted years, violently transforming from part-time, weekend warriors into fully mobilized, highly disciplined assault troops who were now violently trapped inside the suffocating pitch-black hulls of fully armored LVT Amtraks, mathematically hurtling toward the most heavily defended, deeply lethal stretch of coastline on the entire planet. Among these deeply terrified, violently seasick young Virginians, desperately gripping their vomit-covered rifles in the freezing, violently churning English Channel, were two fiercely devoted, incredibly inseparable brothers, 24-year-old Raymond Hoback and his 30-year-old older brother Bedford. Raymond was the much quieter, deeply reflective sibling, tightly, desperately clutching a small, fragile, heavily worn Bible that his fiercely loving mother, Massey, had beautifully, meticulously inscribed and gifted to him for a peaceful, deeply distant Christmas in 1938. As the heavy steel ramps of their landing craft violently, catastrophically crashed down into the freezing, blood-red surf at exactly 6:30 in the morning, directly in front of a massive, heavily fortified German strongpoint in Omaha's infamous Juneau sector, the absolute, unmitigated apocalypse violently, mercilessly devoured Company A. Within a matter of mere, deeply agonizing minutes, the violently exposed, completely unsupported company had mathematically suffered an incredibly staggering, completely paralyzing casualty rate of over 90%, as thousands of supersonic, flesh-tearing, armor-piercing rounds from interlocking MG-42 machine gun nests ruthlessly, systematically annihilated the deeply terrified young men before they could even physically unholster their saturated, useless weapons. Out of the deeply proud, heavily armed roster of more than 200 fiercely determined men who violently stormed that freezing, blood-soaked stretch of Normandy sand, fewer than 20 deeply traumatized, physically shattered survivors miraculously managed to desperately reach the incredibly fragile, totally inadequate safety of the concrete seawall alive. The two deeply inseparable, fiercely loyal Hoback brothers were tragically, mathematically among the hundreds of violently slaughtered Americans who absolutely did not make it across that apocalyptic, heavily defended expanse of freezing beach. Bedford was violently, instantly killed by a devastating supersonic round directly to his face as he desperately waded through the heavily mined, aggressively churning surf, while the quiet, deeply religious Raymond was violently, entirely obliterated by a screaming, highly explosive mortar round that detonated directly at his freezing feet, completely destroying his physical body so absolutely that his remains were tragically, permanently lost to the vast, uncaring ocean. Weeks later, on a quiet, deeply peaceful Sunday morning in July, as the completely unsuspecting Hoback family was quietly preparing for their local church service, the deeply grieving local sheriff awkwardly, solemnly stood on their wooden front porch, violently clutching a devastating, world-shattering yellow telegram officially confirming Bedford's violent, blood-soaked death, only to violently deliver a second, equally apocalyptic telegram the very next agonizing day declaring Raymond permanently missing in action, forcing their deeply shattered father to violently walk out to the isolated barn, just so absolutely nobody would see him physically break down and weep. But the deeply tragic, profoundly heartbreaking saga of the Hoback brothers did not entirely mathematically conclude in the freezing, blood-stained sands of the heavily fortified French coast. Weeks after the apocalyptic, world-shattering massacre, the deeply grieving Hoback family miraculously, incredibly received a heavily battered, sand-crusted package from a completely unknown, deeply empathetic American soldier named Corporal Harold Creighton from West Virginia, who had miraculously quietly discovered Raymond's precious, deeply cherished 1938 Bible lying abandoned in the violently churned, blood-soaked sand of the invasion beach. Creighton, completely innocently unaware that the quiet, deeply religious young Virginian had been violently, totally obliterated by fascist artillery, assumed the fragile, deeply sacred book had simply fallen from a heavy pack and kindly, respectfully mailed it back to his fiercely grieving mother, Massey, who instantly, permanently enshrined the heavily worn, sand-filled Bible as her absolute, most deeply cherished possession for the entire remainder of her deeply shattered life. 19 fiercely proud, deeply innocent young men from the tiny, isolated town of Bedford were violently, permanently slaughtered on the apocalyptic morning of D-Day, mathematically enduring the absolute highest per capita loss of any single community in the entire United States, completely, tragically confirming the absolute worst, deeply paranoid fears of the fiercely skeptical British High Command, that completely green, entirely untested American soldiers would be violently, systematically massacred the absolute second they touched the heavily fortified, deeply lethal fortress of the terrifying German war machine. Months before the apocalyptic, blood-drenched dawn of June 6th, the brilliant, deeply analytical 51-year-old American commander, Norman Cota, had coldly, mathematically predicted this exact, unmitigated catastrophe during highly classified planning conferences in the heavily guarded war rooms of England. Cota had violently, relentlessly argued for a massive pre-dawn assault, desperately pleading with the deeply fossilized Allied High Command to aggressively land the terrified, seasick troops in the pitch-black darkness to mathematically utilize the absolute life-saving element of tactical surprise. He explicitly, aggressively warned the assembled aristocratic officers that blindly relying on a massive aerial bombardment to completely shatter the terrifying Atlantic Wall was a fundamentally flawed, mathematically suicidal doctrine, but he was ruthlessly, completely overruled by deeply optimistic superiors who believed their colossal firepower was absolutely infallible. Recognizing the suffocating, terrifying reality of the mechanized meat grinder his heavily burdened men were about to violently face, Cota gathered his deeply anxious staff on the gloomy afternoon of June 5th and delivered a chilling, profoundly unromanticized briefing, violently demanding that when the mathematically perfect plan inevitably disintegrated into absolute blood-soaked chaos, his deeply terrified officers must aggressively, fundamentally improvise to physically survive the impending slaughter. When Cota finally, violently stepped off his heavily battered landing craft at exactly 7:30 in the freezing morning, one full, agonizing hour after the absolute, unmitigated annihilation of the first assault wave, he physically waded into an apocalyptic nightmare that defied human comprehension. 3 heavily burdened soldiers were violently, instantly killed directly in front of him as thousands of screaming, supersonic armor-piercing rounds from interlocking German machine gun nests mercilessly raked his vulnerable, deeply exposed boat. Wading through chest-deep, freezing water that had been completely, horrifyingly stained a thick, dark red by the violently shattered bodies of hundreds of dead and dying American boys, Cota emerged onto a blood-soaked, freezing shoreline completely paralyzed by absolute, suffocating terror. Hundreds of deeply traumatized, violently shaking survivors were frantically pressing their bodies into the wet, freezing sand behind incredibly fragile, entirely inadequate steel obstacles, while others desperately crowded behind a low concrete seawall, utterly incapable of advancing into the terrifying, relentless hurricane of fascist lead that was actively, violently tearing the very beach apart. It was in this exact catastrophic moment of absolute paralyzing fear that the 51-year-old general executed an action of such profound, unmitigated defiance that it permanently altered the mathematical trajectory of the entire Second World War. Refusing to succumb to the deeply rational, overwhelming human instinct to violently press his face into the dirt, Cota stood entirely, defiantly upright, aggressively walking across the open, blood-soaked sand as if the screaming, flesh-tearing German bullets simply, magically did not exist in his physical reality. Moving systematically through the apocalyptic chaos, he aggressively kicked paralyzed men to their freezing feet, shouting over the deafening, percussive roar of heavy artillery, and famously encountered a deeply pinned-down unit of elite, heavily armed 5th Marine Recon Rangers desperately sheltering behind the concrete wall. Demanding to know their fiercely proud unit designation, Cota violently roared the legendary immortal command, "Well, goddammit, then Rangers lead the way," before aggressively ordering a deeply terrified soldier to violently deploy a highly experimental bazooka-launched Bangalore torpedo, mathematically blasting a massive smoking breach through the suffocating coils of heavy German barbed wire, and personally, fearlessly walking through the lethal gap to physically lead his deeply shattered men up the terrifying, death-spitting bluffs. But the absolute, undeniable reality of modern, highly mechanized warfare dictated that deeply courageous infantrymen alone, no matter how fiercely determined, could not mathematically break the sprawling, concrete spine of the terrifying Atlantic Wall without the violent, apocalyptic intervention of heavy Allied naval firepower. 8 miles offshore, as General Omar Bradley agonizingly contemplated the suffocating, humiliating nightmare of a complete American evacuation, Rear Admiral Carlton Bryant aggressively seized absolute, unmitigated tactical control of the chaotic battlefield, violently radioing a legendary desperate command from the heavily armored bridge of the massive, towering Iowa-class battleship USS Texas. Recognizing that the American boys were being systematically, mathematically exterminated on the freezing sands, Bryant explicitly, ruthlessly ordered his highly aggressive fleet of heavy destroyer captains to completely abandon standard naval doctrine and violently drive their massive multi-ton warships directly toward the heavily mined, dangerously shallow waters of the heavily contested beach. These fiercely independent, deeply reckless naval commanders aggressively pushed their massive vessels past the vital safety zones, anchoring a terrifying, almost suicidal 800 yards from the blood-soaked sand, close enough to mathematically absorb incoming German rifle fire to physically, violently rescue the deeply paralyzed infantry. The absolute, unmitigated fury of the United States Navy was violently, relentlessly unleashed at point-blank range as heroic, deeply defiant captains like Harry Sanders on the USS Frankfurt and Commander Ralph Ramey on the USS McCook poured an apocalyptic, unquenchable hurricane of high-explosive shells directly into the heavily fortified German casemates. Ramey maintained such a terrifying, mathematically sustained, and deeply concentrated barrage of heavy naval artillery against a massive, deeply entrenched German gun emplacement for 15 agonizing minutes that the fundamental physical rock strata of the cliff face violently, catastrophically collapsed, aggressively sending massive fascist artillery pieces tumbling through the smoking air into the freezing abyss below. This deeply reckless, profoundly aggressive naval intervention systematically, violently obliterated the terrifying machine gun nests that the catastrophic morning aerial bombardment had completely missed, physically purchasing a narrow, fragile, and deeply blood-soaked American beachhead at an incredibly terrible, agonizing human cost. The deeply skeptical, highly critical British military establishment was quietly, intently watching this absolute, unscripted chaos unfold, mathematically realizing that the Americans had entirely abandoned the deeply rigid textbook of modern warfare to violently, desperately improvise their way off a killing field, fundamentally altering the entire geopolitical balance of the Allied coalition. While the apocalyptic, blood-drenched nightmare of Omaha Beach was violently consuming thousands of young, untested American boys, a fundamentally different, yet equally deeply heroic narrative of absolute defiance was actively, mathematically unfolding just 15 terrifying miles to the west. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., when the fiercely proud, deeply rebellious 56-year-old son of a legendary American president, aggressively demanded to violently step into the suffocating jaws of the mechanized fascist meat grinder. Physically battered by agonizing arthritis, relying heavily on a wooden cane to simply walk, and secretly harboring a completely catastrophic, deeply lethal heart condition that he had meticulously, explicitly hidden from the rigidly fossilized Army medical boards, Roosevelt was the absolute oldest man to violently storm the heavily fortified French beaches on the apocalyptic morning of D-Day. Having been ruthlessly officially denied permission to land with the highly vulnerable first assault wave twice by his deeply anxious commanding officers, he stubbornly, aggressively submitted a formal, mathematically precise written request, fiercely arguing that his physical, highly visible presence on the violently contested sand would crucially, fundamentally steady the deeply terrified, seasick young men who were about to be violently hurled into the terrifying, interlocking fields of German machine gun fire. When his heavily burdened, violently churning assault wave finally hit the freezing, treacherous waters of Utah Beach, the profoundly unpredictable, chaotic English Channel aggressively pushed their deeply vulnerable, heavily armored Higgins PT boats nearly 2,000 terrifying yards completely south of their meticulously planned, mathematically designated landing zone. Stepping off the violently swaying steel ramp onto the freezing sand, completely armed only with his wooden cane and a customized pearl-handled M1911 revolver, the 56-year-old general calmly, coldly assessed the catastrophic navigational failure that would have instantly mathematically paralyzed a rigidly doctrinal British commander. Instead of violently forcing his deeply terrified, heavily burdened infantrymen to aggressively march across miles of exposed, violently contested open ground under a screaming hurricane of fascist artillery to reach their theoretically correct position, Roosevelt aggressively, famously slammed his cane into the freezing sand and ruthlessly declared, "We will start the war from right here." He personally, fearlessly walked directly through the screaming, supersonic hail of incoming German sniper fire to physically scout highly dangerous, heavily mined routes off the lethal beach, violently orchestrating a beautifully improvised, totally unscripted assault that miraculously, mathematically saved hundreds of young American lives from absolute, unmitigated slaughter. But while the fiercely defiant Roosevelt was aggressively improvising a brilliant, bloodless victory on the relatively quiet sands of Utah, the completely unscripted, violently chaotic American survival instinct was being paid for in massive, catastrophic rivers of human blood back in the suffocating, unmitigated hellscape of Omaha. Amidst the apocalyptic, burning wreckage of the first wave, a deeply courageous 23-year-old Army medic from rural Alabama named Staff Sergeant Ray Lambert was violently, aggressively thrown into a horrifying, mechanized slaughterhouse that completely, fundamentally defied human comprehension. Landing in the catastrophically misnamed, heavily fortified Easy Red sector alongside his fiercely loyal brother, Bill, Lambert watched in absolute paralyzing horror as 24 of the 31 deeply terrified young men in his heavily battered landing craft were violently, instantly obliterated by a screaming, interlocking hurricane of German MG-42 fire before they even physically touched the freezing shoreline. Shot violently through his right elbow as he desperately, agonizingly waded through the heavily mined, blood-stained surf, Lambert entirely ignored his own devastating, flesh-tearing wound and immediately aggressively plunged headfirst into the apocalyptic chaos to violently drag drowning, heavily burdened men from the suffocating, freezing abyss of the churning ocean. Operating with an absolute psychopathic level of cold-blooded medical precision amidst a deafening, terrifying symphony of high-explosive artillery detonations, Lambert aggressively established a desperate, violently exposed makeshift aid station directly behind a massive, deeply cratered slab of concrete that would eternally, historically become known as Ray's Rock. Bleeding profusely from multiple devastating shrapnel wounds, the young Alabama farm boy aggressively, relentlessly pulled deeply traumatized, violently shattered soldiers from the freezing surf, desperately plunging high-dose penicillin syringes directly into their violently severed limbs to instantly, mathematically stop the severe arterial bleeding. He was violently, repeatedly struck by screaming mortar fragments and high-velocity fascist bullets, yet he absolutely, fundamentally refused to stop his desperate, blood-soaked triage until the massive, multi-ton steel ramp of a violently destroyed landing craft catastrophically crashed directly down onto his spine, violently crushing his back and instantly plunging the heroic, deeply exhausted medic into a freezing, pitch-black unconsciousness. Lambert miraculously, mathematically survived the apocalyptic ordeal to live a full, deeply peaceful century. But on that terrifying, blood-soaked morning, his absolute, unyielding refusal to die, lying down, physically saved more than 24 young American lives from the suffocating, freezing waters of the English Channel. This absolute, unmitigated, completely unscripted chaos, the violently shattered American infantry companies, the deeply defiant 51-year-old generals aggressively walking through impenetrable walls of machine gun fire, the 56-year-old arthritic commanders starting the war from the wrong beach, and the violently broken 23-year-old medics refusing to succumb to the apocalypse, was being meticulously, quietly observed by the deeply skeptical, highly critical British military establishment. The heavily fossilized, highly aristocratic generals in London, who had spent 2 agonizing years explicitly, repeatedly predicting in their violently candid private diaries that the completely green, overly optimistic American farm boys would violently, catastrophically break and run at the very first sight of the terrifying German war machine, were now fundamentally, mathematically paralyzed by what they were actually witnessing. According to every single rigid, deeply entrenched metric of traditional British military doctrine, the catastrophic American assault had mathematically, utterly failed within the first 10 agonizing minutes of the invasion. Yet, the profoundly terrifying, undeniable reality unfolding on the blood-soaked sands of Normandy was that when the meticulously engineered, mathematically perfect plan violently died, the Americans simply aggressively improvised a new, brutally effective one directly in the middle of a catastrophic mechanized killing field, completely shattering the British illusion of inherent superiority. The deeply fossilized, rigidly aristocratic British military establishment, safely sequestered within the highly secure, heavily guarded war rooms of London, did not actually, mathematically expect the untested American infantry divisions to violently break and run on the freezing morning of June 6th. They had quietly, cynically, and meticulously planned for that exact catastrophic inevitability. According to every single deeply entrenched metric of traditional British military doctrine, when a highly coordinated, heavily armed unit is violently shattered and a meticulously engineered operational plan catastrophically fails, the absolutely correct tactical response is to immediately retreat, deeply regroup, and mathematically attempt the assault again with vastly superior, overwhelming preparation. At the apocalyptic blood-soaked killing field of Omaha Beach, the mathematically perfect Allied invasion plan had catastrophically, irreversibly failed within the first 10 agonizing minutes of the chaotic, deeply terrifying assault. Entire, fiercely proud infantry companies, completely, violently disintegrated in the freezing surf, highly experienced commanding officers were instantly obliterated before they could shout a single order, and the rigid, deeply vital chain of command, mathematically, fundamentally fragmented into thousands of terrified, isolated pieces. By every single objective, heavily scrutinized standard the British military possessed to mathematically evaluate combat effectiveness, the monumental American amphibious assault had undeniably, absolutely failed. Yet what violently unfolded next on those freezing, blood-stained sands did not fit into any known, rigidly published British model of modern mechanized warfare. Instead of violently succumbing to the absolute, unmitigated slaughter and surrendering to the deeply rational human instinct of absolute despair, the deeply traumatized, heavily bleeding Americans aggressively, fundamentally improvised, completely abandoning the fossilized textbook to forge a desperate, completely unscripted survival strategy directly in the middle of a catastrophic meat grinder. It was not a highly coordinated, mathematically precise military maneuver orchestrated by brilliant generals safely behind the lines. It was a deeply chaotic, intensely visceral uprising of tiny, isolated groups of desperate, terrified young men who absolutely fundamentally refused to die lying face down in the freezing mud. Deeply traumatized sergeants aggressively gathered heavily bleeding survivors from violently shattered companies, and fiercely defiant privates aggressively picked up blood-soaked weapons from the violently shattered bodies of their dead friends, ruthlessly pushing their way up the terrifying, death-spitting bluffs. High above the apocalyptic, heavily cratered beach, the deeply astonished, heavily entrenched German defenders of the fiercely disciplined 352nd Division were watching this absolutely, completely unscripted, mathematically impossible American phenomenon with absolute, paralyzing disbelief from the claustrophobic safety of their thick concrete bunkers. The fiercely battle-hardened fascist veterans had spent agonizing, uninterrupted months meticulously preparing this massive, interlocking kill zone, and they were actively, aggressively pouring thousands of supersonic, flesh-tearing, armor-piercing rounds from their belt-fed MP-40 heavy machine guns directly into the heavily burdened, completely exposed American infantry. According to every single rigid, deeply calculated German military standard, the absolute, unmitigated volume of catastrophic human casualties they had violently inflicted within the very first hour should have completely, irreversibly broken the psychological spine of the terrifying Allied assault, instantly forcing a deeply humiliating, blood-soaked evacuation. Yet, the deeply exhausted, completely deafened German gunners watched in absolute creeping horror as wave after terrifying wave of heavily battered landing craft relentlessly deposited thousands more American boys directly into the screaming apocalyptic hurricane of lead, with the deeply determined survivors stepping directly over the violently shattered corpses of their fallen brothers to aggressively, blindly continue the catastrophic assault. The deeply terrifying, completely unscripted American attack made absolutely zero mathematical or tactical sense to the rigidly disciplined German defenders, yet the catastrophic, unyielding breaking point they had confidently anticipated absolutely never materialized, actively transforming their meticulously planned defensive victory into a suffocating, deeply inescapable nightmare. By the freezing, blood-tinged evening, the fiercely proud German 352nd Division had mathematically permanently lost a staggering 20% of its total combat strength, and their supposedly impregnable, heavily fortified concrete positions were falling one by terrifying one to fiercely determined American ghosts who mathematically, logically, should have been dead hours ago. The brilliant, deeply pragmatic Reichsmarshal Erwin Rommel had explicitly mathematically warned his highest-ranking fascist officers about this exact apocalyptic scenario in the deeply anxious, heavily debated months leading up to the massive invasion, explicitly demanding they mathematically stop the Allies on the freezing beaches or face absolute annihilation. He profoundly, deeply understood the terrifying, unquenchable industrial capacity of the United States, coldly prophesying that if the Allies violently, successfully secured even a single, fragile beachhead, the terrifying fascist empire would mathematically, permanently lose the entire Second World War. While the completely unscripted, apocalyptic chaos of Omaha violently redefined the entire geopolitical landscape, the deeply proud, highly experienced British military forces were actively, aggressively discovering that their own highly calculated, mathematically precise beaches were an absolute blood-soaked nightmare as well, completely stripping away any deeply arrogant grounds for strategic smugness. At the heavily contested Golden Sword beaches, the battle-hardened veterans of the British 50th and 3rd Infantry Divisions were violently slammed by fierce, deeply entrenched German resistance, agonizingly fighting house by heavily fortified house through burning French villages, while suffering massive, deeply sobering human casualties. The deeply ambitious, highly publicized objective of capturing the sprawling, vital city of Caen on the very first day, a masterstroke mathematically promised by the deeply arrogant General Montgomery, violently, catastrophically collapsed when the terrifying 21st Panzer Division launched a massive, aggressively coordinated counterattack that nearly severed the entire fragile British beachhead. Even aggressively supported by their massive, lumbering Churchill crocodile tank destroyers, the British operations remained rigidly textbook, methodical, and profoundly steady, completely lacking the violent, deeply chaotic, entirely unscripted American improvisation that had miraculously, bloodily saved the apocalyptic disaster at Omaha Beach. The deeply fossilized, rigidly methodical British military establishment, which had meticulously, mathematically valued strict operational doctrine and flawless scripted execution above absolutely all else, was now completely, undeniably forced to watch this violently unscripted, deeply chaotic American improvisation and reach a profoundly uncomfortable, world-shattering conclusion. It had mathematically, brutally worked. General Bernard Montgomery himself, a fiercely proud, deeply arrogant British commander who had routinely explicitly treated his highly capable American counterparts with a suffocating, undeniable condescension, was so profoundly moved by the absolute unmitigated courage displayed on those freezing sands that he personally, aggressively pinned the highly coveted purple-ribboned Victoria Cross directly onto General Cota's heavily battered chest. This was absolutely not a routine, deeply bureaucratic piece of polite diplomatic paperwork to appease the fragile alliance. This was the fiercely proud British military establishment formally, undeniably acknowledging that a fiercely independent American general had completely, mathematically saved a catastrophic, blood-soaked moment in the monumental invasion through sheer, unyielding, psychopathic force of will. Deep within the heavily fortified, deeply classified war rooms of London, Field Marshal Alan Brooke continued to aggressively, meticulously fill his private, brutally candid diaries with scathing, deeply analytical criticisms of the wildly unorthodox, heavily chaotic American tactical methods. Yet, amidst the rigid, fossilized British complaints about their seemingly reckless, overly broad frontal assaults and mathematically wasteful logistical supply chains, a deeply profound, fundamentally new sentiment began to quietly, undeniably emerge in the dark ink. Absolute, unmitigated respect for their catastrophic, blood-soaked results. The fiercely proud British officers, who had spent agonizing, uninterrupted years explicitly, mathematically questioning whether the green, untested American farm boys from Iowa and Texas could even physically stand against the terrifying German war machine without instantly shattering, were now fundamentally forced to question only their unorthodox methods, completely, silently acknowledging their undeniable, world-shattering effectiveness in the brutal, mechanized meat grinder. This terrifying, blood-soaked geopolitical shift was mathematically, irreversibly cemented as the suffocating, highly contested summer of 1944 violently transformed into a massive, overwhelming American breakout across the heavily defended European continent. By the time the fiercely aggressive Allied forces violently shattered the heavily fortified Normandy hedgerows in the apocalyptic Operation Cobra and aggressively liberated the sprawling sunlit streets of Paris, the mathematical balance of the monumental alliance had permanently, decisively tilted toward the terrifying industrial and military capacity of Washington. The British had undeniably, fundamentally contributed massive, absolutely vital lifelines to this apocalyptic victory, most notably when their deeply secretive, highly brilliant intelligence operatives aggressively, mathematically cracked the unbreakable German military codes by masterfully reverse engineering the highly classified Navajo Enigma machine, providing deeply crucial, life-saving information about fascist troop movements that actively prevented thousands of American casualties. Furthermore, the deeply ingenious, highly calculated British strategic deception operations, completely anchored by the massive, wildly successful Phantom Army illusion of Operation Market Garden's deception at the heavily fortified Pas-de-Calais, had flawlessly, mathematically convinced a deeply paranoid Adolf Hitler to keep his absolutely critical, terrifying panzer reserves completely paralyzed and uselessly stationed miles away from the vital, blood-soaked Normandy beaches during those decisive apocalyptic first days. The battle-hardened, fiercely proud British infantry had also aggressively, willingly drawn the massive, heavily armored brunt of the terrifying German mechanized counterattacks around the sprawling, heavily contested city of Caen, violently pinning down elite fascist tank divisions in a suffocating, grinding war of attrition that physically, mathematically, allowed the terrifying American armored columns to aggressively, relentlessly break out into the open, vulnerable French countryside. Yet, despite these monumental, deeply vital British sacrifices and brilliant strategic masterstrokes, The fundamental psychological dynamic of the entire global alliance had been completely, violently rewritten in the freezing, blood-stained surf of Omaha Beach in a matter of hours. It was no longer a deeply condescending, highly unequal partnership between a wise, battle-hardened British teacher and a naive, deeply untested American student. It was a terrifying, deeply forged brotherhood of absolute, mathematically proven equals, bound permanently together by the catastrophic shared trauma of the apocalyptic invasion. This deeply profound, unshakable mutual respect, violently born amidst the screaming hurricane of fascist machine gun fire and drowning tanks, would aggressively, permanently outlast the suffocating horrors of the Second World War, mathematically laying the unbreakable geopolitical foundation for Western security for generations to come, all violently ignited by the absolute, unmitigated defiance of a 51-year-old American general who absolutely, fundamentally refused to crawl in the sand. The deeply profound, violently forged legacy of Lieutenant General Norman Cota absolutely did not mathematically conclude on the freezing, blood-stained morning of June 6th, as the fiercely defiant 51-year-old commander aggressively survived the apocalyptic slaughter of Normandy to lead American boys through some of the most terrifying, suffocating campaigns of the entire global conflict. By the violently contested freezing August of 1944, Cota aggressively assumed total unmitigated command of the highly elite 101st Airborne's 28th Ranger Battalion, ruthlessly leading his heavily burdened, battle-hardened troops straight into the claustrophobic, mechanized meat grinder of the Hurtgen Forest and the freezing, apocalyptic desperation of the Battle of the Bulge. When he finally, quietly retired from the deeply entrenched military establishment in 1946 as a highly decorated Major General, he absolutely, fundamentally refused to romantically boast about his terrifying, world-shattering actions on D-Day, explicitly, humbly deflecting all monumental historical praise directly to the violently shattered, deeply terrified young men who had actively, aggressively bled and died in the freezing surf beside him. When the profoundly courageous general quietly passed away in the deeply peaceful, isolated city of Wichita, Kansas, in 1971 at the age of 78, his heavily abbreviated, incredibly modest obituary tragically, mathematically omitted the absolute unmitigated reality that he had personally, violently birthed the immortal Ranger motto and successfully, aggressively walked an entire paralyzed army off a suffocating, catastrophic killing field. Yet, the deeply traumatized, fiercely loyal American soldiers who had actively, miraculously survived that terrifying, blood-soaked morning absolutely, fundamentally remembered the 51-year-old general who violently refused to crawl, passing down the deeply unbelievable, completely unscripted stories of his apocalyptic defiance to their deeply astonished children and grandchildren. For decades, a deeply passionate, highly relentless grassroots historical effort has been aggressively underway to officially mathematically rectify the deeply fossilized bureaucratic oversight of the Allied military establishment by formally upgrading Cota's deeply prestigious combat-issued Navy Cross to the absolute highest pinnacle of American military valor, the Medal of Honor. While the rigidly slow, deeply bureaucratic paperwork of the modern military has mathematically stalled, and the vital, living eyewitnesses to his terrifying, blood-soaked bravery have entirely, quietly faded into the dark annals of history, the absolute, undeniable truth remains permanently etched into the global record. Norman Cota mathematically profoundly knew the highly anticipated, heavily engineered invasion plan would catastrophically fail. He explicitly, aggressively warned his deeply arrogant superiors, and when the absolute, unmitigated disaster violently manifested exactly as he had coldly predicted, he did not violently cower or cynically retreat. He stood entirely upright in the middle of a screaming, mechanized massacre and aggressively, violently improvised a miraculous, blood-soaked victory. Today, resting in absolute, deeply solemn silence on a towering, violently contested bluff directly overlooking the sprawling, black volcanic sands of Omaha Beach, the incredibly vast, deeply sacred Normandy American Cemetery mathematically contains exactly 9,389 perfectly aligned, immaculate white crosses and stars of David. stretching across 172 deeply peaceful, beautifully manicured acres permanently, officially gifted to the United States by the fiercely grateful people of France. This massive, deeply heartbreaking city of the dead violently, silently testifies to the absolute, unimaginable human cost of shattering the terrifying fascist empire. Among these heavily honored, deeply tragic graves lies the fiercely rebellious 56-year-old Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., resting permanently, eternally beside his fiercely courageous brother, Quentin, who was violently shot out of the smoking skies during the apocalyptic, world-shattering carnage of the First World War. Somewhere buried deep beneath the meticulously maintained, violently contested French soil, the fragile, sand-crusted 1938 Bible of a quiet, deeply innocent boy from Virginia serves as a permanent, heartbreaking testament to the 20 fiercely proud, violently obliterated young men from the tiny, unsuspecting town of Bedford, who eagerly joined the National Guard for a single shiny dollar, only to be mathematically, systematically slaughtered on a freezing, terrifying beach they had absolutely never seen. The deeply arrogant, highly fossilized British military establishment had fundamentally, mathematically doubted the absolute physical and psychological courage of these incredibly young, profoundly untested American boys, predicting an unmitigated, catastrophic collapse at the very first sight of the terrifying German war machine. But after violently, intimately watching these deeply terrified, heavily bleeding farm boys mathematically absorb catastrophic, historically unprecedented casualties, and absolutely fundamentally refuse to violently surrender the blood-soaked sand, whatever deeply ingrained aristocratic doubts remained in London were instantly, permanently incinerated and replaced by a profound, unyielding respect. Field Marshal Alan Brooke's fiercely candid, brutally critical post-invasion diary entries were absolutely not a deeply humiliating formal apology, but rather a profoundly quiet, highly honest geopolitical realization that the green, untested American army had violently, successfully passed a catastrophic, blood-soaked test that would have mathematically, completely shattered the finest, most experienced veteran legions of Europe. The fragile, heavily strained alliance that was violently, permanently forged in the freezing, blood-red surf on June 6, 1944, had mathematically ceased to be a deeply unequal, condescending relationship, officially, aggressively evolving into a terrifying, world-shattering brotherhood of absolute equals. So, as we fiercely, critically examine the absolute, catastrophic reality of the D-Day invasion, a deeply profound, fiercely debated historical question permanently remains for you to aggressively answer. Do you believe the monumental, blood-soaked success of Omaha Beach was mathematically achieved because of the brilliant, deeply unscripted, psychopathic improvisation of commanders like Norman Cota? Or was it simply the absolute, overwhelming, terrifying volume of American industrial bodies violently hurled at the fascist machine until it mathematically broke? Drop your explosive, fiercely debated historical opinions down in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button to join our relentless, deeply uncompromising pursuit of the absolute truth of World War II, and I will see you in the next dark, heavily contested chapter of history.